We are going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If you have your Bibles with you, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And I'll meet you there. We have been discussing difficult texts of the Bible together. And we'll have a few more weeks. Lord willing, I'll try to end, I'll probably end up ending around the time that Larry does in the next few weeks or so. And if not the same week, then real close thereon. But we have a few more that I've been given, and I'm grateful for that. I absolutely love these particular verses and texts, and especially when you give me these verses and I know that it's something you're desiring to learn more about, that you have concerns about, and that you're interested in, and I can know that it will be a blessing for you. 1 Corinthians 11, though, we're going to begin in verse 2, and our question here, as it relates to this passage, is basically just an explanation as to what is going on with these head coverings. What are the head coverings? Does it apply today, especially when it talks about the women needing to have their heads covered? 1 Corinthians 11, this is an interesting beginning. I'm starting in verse 2 because some would argue, and I somewhat would agree, that really chapter 10 ends in chapter 11 and verse 1. It's interesting to me how they divided this up. Again, they're wiser than I, and I'm not trying to pretend like I know more than they do, but personally I would have started the chapter at verse 2 because that's where this thought begins. Chapter 11, verse 1 really is kind of a concluding passage to the previous thought. So we begin in verse 2 when he says the word now. Now, I praise you. Remember, the book of 1 Corinthians, after about chapter 4, are basically Paul's response to these questions that were given to him from the household of Chloe, from the household of Stephanus. And so he's basically taking, and as men have divided this chapter by chapter, and answering questions about different issues. So in verse 2, we have a new issue here, a new question. He doesn't read us the question, but we can get a good idea as to what it was. All right, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you, the traditions, the commands and precepts that are continuing to be obeyed. Verse 3, but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is the man. And the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Verse 9, neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman was created for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. Verse 12, a few more verses. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. Judging yourselves. Is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have a long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have a long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given for her a covering. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. Very interesting section. Where else in the New Testament does the Bible discuss this topic of head coverings? Do you know of any other passages in the New Testament that discuss this? I don't believe I know of any either. As far as I know, this is the only place. Now there you can talk about modesty and apparel and those kinds of things. But as far as this concept of praying and prophesying with a head covering, this seems to be the only portion of the New Testament that would address this subject. So what we learn about it, we learn from this chapter. And so let's answer some questions about it. To begin with, as always, we first want to set up the what. We need to understand the what of this chapter, this portion, the context. All right, we read a pretty good chunk of verses. I don't think we need to add or take away to that. So just based on that reading, what seems to be the context or the usage here of this idea of coverings? We'll talk about what the covering is in a minute, but what's the context? What's going on here? In your own words, anyone?
Authority and submission.
Excellent. Authority and submission. Absolutely. This idea of head coverings, this section of Scripture, very significantly, is about subjection or submission. Verses 3 through 8. Look at verse 3. In verse 3, you've got this hierarchy. The head of every man is who? Christ. The head of every woman is who? The man. And of course, the head of Christ is God. Very interesting, this hierarchy as it's built. Woman is in subjection to man. Man is in subjection to Christ. And Christ as a man in subjection to God. And so in verse 4, with that in mind, if a man prays or prophesies, and by the way, notice that's the context. We're not necessarily just talking about walking around in public like this. Maybe there are some principles there, but the context, the immediate context technically, is when they're praying or prophesying. Right? We're talking about some miraculous gifts most likely in this context, because in chapter 12 he's going to continue that thought. But really all the way through 14. But in verse number 4 there, if a man is prophesying or praying having his head covered, he's dishonoring his head. All right, based on what we read, why is it that the head covering would be dishonoring for a man to wear? Because what is that covering representative of? What is it symbolic of in this context? What do we know about their culture, their customs with this head covering, based on what we just read? Why would a man not have to wear it, but a woman would? Because it symbolized what? That subjection. She was to pray or prophesy with that head covering, which was representative of the fact that she was in subjection, submissive to her husband. The man, however, is not to wear a covering, and if he does, it is dishonoring his head. Because he is, or rather there is no authority between he and Christ. There's no man, as it were, that he is in subjection to. He's in subjection to God. So on earth, he is the leader. And so he's not to wear a covering. And if he did, he would be dishonoring his head, because he would be showing a submission, a subjection to another individual, another person, such as his wife in this context. And that's not appropriate. That's not how this works. Man is not made for the woman, Paul said, but the woman for the man. And so then we get to verse 5. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. What does he mean there by shaven? Cut all her hair off, exactly, being bald, having her head shaved, as we would say. So in verse 5 there, if she prays or prophesies being uncovered, then she's dishonoring her head, because there's that failure to symbolize that submission. And so look at verse 6, and then we're going to talk about this covering for a minute. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. Question: is the covering a reference only to hair, or is there something else that he's referencing here, like a veil or something to that extent that would have been on top of her hair? And how do you know? We can be sure which one it is. Jim, what do you think?
Well, it's both, actually.
Okay.
Because towards the end of the verse, her covering is her hair.
Okay, good.
But here, if you just read, if she's shorn, then she's covered with something else opposite the hair.
Exactly. Exactly. That's the key. And the hair is absolutely used as a covering here, but maybe I should have worded it as to say, is there anything besides the hair? Because there absolutely is, and Jim's right. Look back at verses 4 through 6 again. Notice, if the covering, and there are a lot of brethren who argue that the covering is only a reference to the hair, but here's the problem with this, two problems. Number one, with the male, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. If the covering is the hair, the only way a man could pray and not dishonor himself is to do what with his hair? To shave it off. He'd have to shave his hair off. He couldn't have any hair. Right? Do you think Paul's telling them in your culture, guys, you've got to be bald? You can't have any hair. Of course not. Another problem, verse 5 and 6, if a woman prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, it says even all one as if she were shaven. Right? You notice there's a difference between it. She might as well be, or it's as if she was shaven, but that's not what she actually is, because it's referencing something else, and that must be that covering. For if the woman be not covered, verse 6, let her also be shorn or shaven. So there's a difference. There's something else going on here besides her hair, and that is a reference to what we would think of as a veil, a covering. Someone might ask, how much did it have to cover? How large did it have to be? We don't know. He doesn't specify here. But there was some sort of covering, some sort of veil, hat-like entity that would sit on top of her head that she had to keep on her head when she prayed or prophesied. All right, any comments or questions so far? Does that make sense? All right, let's keep going, building on this. Did I already jump ahead? I did. That's all right. We'll leave it up there. Look at verse 6 again. Verse 6. As far as whether or not this applies today, read it with me. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. What is that if doing there? What's Paul's condition here? Is this something that is a command from God that applies to all people, everywhere, all time? In other words, women, when you're praying at home, do you need to have a covering on your head, outside of your hair? Why not? How do we know that this doesn't apply to the Lord's body today in the United States? Okay, Paul says, you're probably referencing there 1 Corinthians 14, he references about verse 37, if any of you think he's a prophet or spiritual, let him know that the things I'm speaking are from the Lord. And it's interesting, I said 1 Corinthians 14, I believe that's right. Anyways, 1 Corinthians 7, what I want to reference, you remember he talks about these opportunities where he's speaking of his own judgment. There were times that Paul kind of pushed that to the side and said, okay, I'm going to say this by concession. I would that you abide as I am in your marriages. And we know that's not a commandment from God because God certainly wouldn't tell us we cannot marry. That would contradict the Bible. So there were times, 90% of what Paul says, really more than that, are going to be commands. But there are times when Paul pushes that to the side and kind of says, based on the circumstances in what's going on around you, it might be wise to do this or to do that. Now in this case, it's a little different than that because this was a command for them. But why? Why was it commanded for them? What do you think? Or maybe you had another thought, which is fine too.
Well, getting back to what you said earlier, is that at the end he said, if anybody be contentious, we have no such custom.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a minute.
Why it wasn't pertaining to us now.
Okay, good. You're exactly right. Verse 16 is a huge part of that. Hold that thought because I want you to see something in verse 6, and then we're going to jump to the end. You're exactly right, though. So this was, and just even, let's go ahead and take that thought for a moment, though. He references there a custom. What does that mean when he says, references a custom? It was their culture. It was their culture. In other words, this is what they did. This was their tradition, right? For example, let's say that I decided to go into a restaurant and have a meal, and a young lady, I sat down at a table with a young lady, and I took this wedding ring off and I put it in my pocket. Would that be pleasing to God? No. Now, is there anything in the Bible that says it's sinful for you to take your wedding ring off when you're speaking to a person of the opposite sex? No, but why is that wrong? Because what does this ring, based upon our culture, what does it symbolize? You're married. So if I'm hiding this, it's like, hey, I'm not really married, I'm free. So we're violating something there because of our culture. Are you with me? So there are principles that apply. So in this case, in verse 6, he says, if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. What does the word if mean? Does that mean it's always going to apply? It's always a rule? There's an exception. When would it not be a requirement for her to have a covering? Based on verse 6. If it's not a what? If it's not a shame. If it's not a shame. All right, let's build on that. Like Brother Greg said, and he's exactly right. Let's jump down to verses 13 through 16. This kind of will build on what verse 6 says. Well, I'm having all kinds of technical... It's about time I had some technical difficulties. It's gone so smooth for me. Got to eventually mess up on me. See if we can get it back up there. Shrunken version, but it's there. Oh, that's because I don't have the... That's why. I didn't have it on the play. No wonder it looked like that. Now then. Y'all were seeing literally what I was seeing. It was the... Okay, now we're good. Verses 13 and following. I apologize for that. That was my fault. User difficulties. Hate to admit it, but it's true. Verse 13. Judging yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? What does he mean when he says judge in yourselves? What's he getting at here in verse 13? In other words, what does he mean when he says you... Okay, good. It's internal. You kind of already know. You don't really need me to tell you this. This is something you already know. Judging yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Why would he say that? Why would he assume this is something that they could really judge without Paul even addressing? Exactly, because it was the custom. It's what they did, just like we wear a wedding ring. I hope that's maybe a good example. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Verse 14, doth not even nature itself teach you, and now he's going to reference the hair, that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him. Right? This, even today, not to the, a man having long hair, that certainly is okay, but for the most part, even today, men normally don't have long hair. Right? The majority of men keep their hair short. That's just the way culture dictates it. That's just what we do. Men have short hair, and women normally have long hair. Always, no, not necessarily, but we can kind of relate to this because in our culture, it's kind of this way to some degree. But for them, it was a bit more serious because of what it symbolized. Our hair doesn't symbolize in our culture what it did for them necessarily. But verse 15, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. And so we get to verse 16. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. Verse 16 is a challenging verse, because when you first read it, you might assume that what he's saying is, we don't have any custom to wear a head covering. It's not part of our culture, and so it doesn't apply. He's actually saying the opposite. When you dive into this and dig a little deeper here, what he's saying is, if you want to be contentious with what I'm telling you, and suggest that there are women who are not wearing head coverings or men that are wearing head coverings, he says we don't have that custom. Our custom is not the opposite of what I'm telling you. In other words, we do have this custom as far as having or wearing the head coverings. I hope I'm explaining that in a way that makes sense. It seems like you want it to say what Paul is getting at is, hey, we don't have that issue. We don't have that custom to where you have to wear a head covering. But he's saying the opposite. We don't have a custom that you wouldn't wear the head covering. And that's why Paul is having to teach them this at Corinth. If you want to be contentious, then no, he says that this is something we're not violating. David, what do you think?
Some versions say we have no other custom.
No other custom. Does anybody have a version that says that? What version is that? I hadn't noticed that before. No other custom? Does anybody have one that says that? Tamanisha? I'm sorry? ISV says that? What's ISV? I'm not familiar with that. Okay. There you go. Okay. Fair enough. Okay, so the ISV, I'm not familiar with that translation, but the ISV says then... Okay, good. The NLT says that too then. And that's pretty accurate, because that's what Paul's basically saying is we don't have a custom otherwise. Our custom is these head coverings. What we don't have is a custom that's other than that. Today, do we have that custom in our culture, the head coverings and submission, publicly speaking? No, we don't have that particular custom. Jim?
Was this kind of a question in this was a Gentile congregation, and didn't the Jewish women wear veils and things?
That's true. There's some history there, and I didn't dive into it a whole lot, but there is certainly some, and you can even see that debate coming up between that situation, the Jewish women and these Gentiles. But I didn't, I don't know for sure. I didn't dive into the history therein too much as to what exactly, and I should have. Maybe I should have. And y'all may have some more thoughts on that I'm not aware of.
So you're saying that this was their custom, but not a commandment of God?
Well, it is a commandment of God because it is their custom, if that makes sense.
Why would it not be our custom?
Well, that's a great question. In other words, notice he said there, you could judge in yourselves. You guys know already that your head covering is a sign of submission. The issue, let's say this applied to us today. If we did that, the violation for a woman then to not have her head covered, the violation would be that she was not showing her submission. And that was something that they did culturally. That wasn't something that God ever instituted in His Word and said, this is what I want all women to do. This was something that they did in that culture, in that custom there in Corinth, or these Jewish women did anyways at least. And maybe, I don't know if I'm explaining it the best way. Help me out, Jim.
What I was looking at, this seems to be a question when they're teaching and praying.
Yeah, exactly, yes, exactly.
The question is, when would a woman publicly teach or preach anyway?
Well, that's true, absolutely. And that's why I say, the symbolism and it's interesting because he's talking about something that's a sign and a symbol. It's something that's going to be seen, but there's no evidence that he's addressing anything that necessarily is public. But he's talking about something that's symbolic to the public. These women praying and prophesying, maybe it was in a group of women. Maybe it was primarily at home. He doesn't necessarily say what when they're doing it or where they are, but he addresses it as though it's something that others are going to see, if that makes sense. And that seems to be why it's an issue.
I thought in the Church of Christ that custom continues today because of long hair for a woman. That her hair is covered. In other words, they're still abiding, if they have long hair, still abiding by that custom.
Yes, and that's why I say to some degree we kind of still have a culture of women have long hair, men have short hair. But the difference is we don't associate a covering with the idea of submission like they did in Corinth. We have different traditions. We have different customs. Like if a woman has, she has cancer or something and she loses her hair, nobody looks at her and thinks, wow, if she doesn't have cancer, it wasn't because of that, then she's being, disrespectful to her husband. Nobody would think that because we don't use it in that sense. We don't look at it that way. Is that making any sense, speaking of sense? That's not our culture. We don't judge a person's respect or submission based upon their hair or extra covering like they did. Go ahead, though. You had another thought?
I don't know where the verse is about men being effeminate.
Yes.
Men having long hair, is that or not effeminate?
I would think not. Based on the word for effeminate, the idea of being like a woman, and again, you think about our culture. If you see a man with long hair, do you automatically assume he is an effeminate guy? He's a feminine guy who is having that word effeminate. There's a lot to that. We're dealing with effeminacy, with this idea of changing genders. That's effeminate. But just the idea of having long hair, now, if a man is literally cross-dressing in public, then sure, we're going to think there's some issues here. But in our culture, a guy having long hair, assuming he's dressed like a man and acts like a man, we really don't look at that, or at least I don't. Does anybody think that that's an issue in today's America? It's really not here anyways. But if it was, then it would be an issue.
What I'm trying to understand
Sure.
is that I asked, was that custom then, the Word of God, was that God's commandment? And why would it not be today?
Right. That's a good question. And maybe I'm not answering it the best I can. Somebody help me out with explaining. It was a command to the church at Corinth because of what their culture was. And hence Paul's discussion about verse 13 there, judging within yourselves, and verse 16, the custom, and in verse 6, if it be a shame, then she needs to be covered. So for me, if it's not a shame, then it's not an issue, right? It's not something, my question would be this: if women had to wear the head covering today, what would be God's reason for us, right? What would women be violating? Why would God? Because there's always, Deuteronomy says God always gives commands for our good, and everything has its purpose. But with that, what would we be violating based upon? Did you have a thought, Greg? I'm just asking. I'm not saying that proves anything.
What are we violating today? I mean, that's what the denominationalism is saying to us about a lot of things. What are we violating today? Musical instruments, bring up all these same kind of things.
Yeah.
You just got through saying that he was saying the opposite, that we do have these customs, is what he was saying. And he says, in the church of God.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if that is a custom in the church of God then, why is it not now?
That's the question. That's what I'm trying to answer. Somebody else.
To my understanding, it's not saying that it's a custom for the church, but it's a custom for the culture.
Right.
So if you go to the world, there's certain customs that certain churches have, not certain churches, certain cultures have.
Right.
That doesn't apply to the Church of Christ. I have never heard that in the Church of Christ, it's a custom for women to have long hair. It's not biblical. That it's a command by God that we have to have long hair. It's not a sin. It's what I'm understanding that. This is the custom, and I believe it didn't only apply for the church. I believe it applied, and it still applies today. Some of them still cover the hair,
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up because this still applies in some areas because of the culture. You see him just reference so much here, this culture and this idea of nature and judging and this idea of if it be, that conditional. Let's keep going with this, Jane.
It says if it's a shame, if she feels shame, she should cover. Isn't that sort of like eating meat that was for idols? If it bothers you, then you should do it. If it affects your conscience, then you should keep your conscience clean. So if you feel that it's a requirement, then you need to cover your head.
Yeah.
If you feel it's a requirement as a lady, you need to wear long hair. It's obvious I don't think that.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think that's a good point. If you feel that it is an issue, then you need to abide by it.
You need to abide by
You need to abide
what
by it.
affects your conscience.
Yeah, and you see all of these other violations. Instrumental music is addressed in will worship and vain worship and homosexuality. All of these topics are listed. The Bible makes it clear. These are things you just don't do. But this is not one of those topics. This is something that's unique. And again, you've got to remember that this is just a question that they asked for their culture in their day. And so Paul addresses it in the same book where he also in chapter 7 said, these are not commands, but here's my judgment on the matter based on these situations. I think Jim was next and then we'll go back down.
I think what he's trying to say here is with custom, the woman was covered to show submission.
Right.
If you don't have the covering there, how are you going to show submission?
Absolutely. Right.
In other words, are you going to have longer hair? But I'm thinking he doesn't want men and women he wants them to be distinctly different, not dress like each other.
Absolutely.
You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. There is a principle there, absolutely, in that men and women are to be distinctive. You should not see a person and wonder, is this a guy or a girl? And I'm not talking about just, sometimes it may, some people just may not look very, somebody could probably, I'm not a very manly guy. Maybe you can, but you know what I mean. There's a difference between a person who just doesn't try, who tries to be a pad, as they say. There was a movie that came out years ago. Is that the name of it? Pat? Yeah. Where it was a person, the whole movie was, I haven't seen the whole thing, but I saw part of it. It's about, we just don't know if this person is a man or a woman, and we don't want to be a pat, as it were. We want to show clearly I'm a man or I'm a woman, and keep that distinction there. That's a principle here, absolutely. Carlos?
Yeah, and I think we have to look at, in addition to the cultural distinctions that we've already been talking about, and the sort of the way that time also has an impact on cultural meanings and expression. I mean, we have to look at, in addition to those things, because we're talking about something that Paul talked about 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And there are a lot of things culturally that were applicable 2,000 years ago that are not applicable now under any strict reading of the scriptures.
Yes.
But in addition to that, we have to look at the idea that, long hair and short hair really are relevant. Now, this is not directly on point with what, but we do have to look at this to stretch the discussion out, that those things are kind of relativistic in a way, and they vary within cultures. Mm-hmm. People have different biological, the coarseness of the hair, the way it grows, all of those things are different. And so to try to standardize one thing and say this is long hair and this is not long hair, it just doesn't make any sense. It's virtually impossible.
That's a very good point.
That's
a very good point.
Look
Yeah.
at that too, as we factor that in as we try to say what these things mean absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point. And in addition to that, and then I'll grab Aaron up there, is if this was something that did apply and God wanted all men everywhere to do this, and this was something women would always do, it seems to me that He would tell us what to use. That it was something that Paul addressed to them, and he knew that they knew what he was talking about, but we don't know. We don't know what they had on their head. We have no identification as to what that covering is supposed to be, how big it's supposed to be. Is it in the assembly? Is it just when I'm at home? Is it in public? Does it, all of those questions that aren't answered here, kind of going along with what he's saying in the time and all of that. Absolutely good point as well. Aaron?
I think a kind of simple way to slide it into perspective and just visually seeing something that we see today is, Jesus and the apostles probably didn't go visit people in shirt and tie, but preacher and the elders nowadays will do that. That's also a cultural difference between then versus now, and you can sort of look at this as sort of the same way.
Yeah, kind of the clothing changes. Yeah.
Evolve into, this is what is acceptable. This may be what is expected of these people versus, what was done back then.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, back then, Jesus might have walked around in sandals, but we probably don't normally wear sandals to worship. Not that would be inherently sinful, but it's just not what our culture does. We think it's more professional. We feel that it is to dress up a little bit. I missed you earlier, Mike. I apologize.
I was just thinking, I don't know if I think it still is in the Jewish faith that men wear a little...
Yes. Yes.
I don't know if that tradition has been there. I assume it has been all through.
Yes, I guess so. And I never really thought about that in comparison with this, because here it says don't wear a covering, interestingly, but might be interesting to do some research on the history of that and where that came from. But they've been doing it as long as, I guess, as long as any of us have been alive. Exactly, it is.
Another thing that kind of occurred to me, this is just kind of silly, but it seems like every picture you ever see of Jesus, he's got long hair.
Yes, that's true, yeah. How they depict him.
Or
Yeah.
what we supposed to be long hair.
That's true, yeah. What is long hair?
We have to look at it like the pictures look like it looks relevant, but then how long did the women wear their hair? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's all relative to, if we're talking about the difference between men and women and distinguishing. Perhaps women typically wore their hair, all of them, all the way down their back, so that a man with shoulder-length hair, it may not have been long
Yeah.
hair.
To us, that's long hair, but to them, it may not have been.
So that
And
kind of goes to what I was trying to say earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Great thoughts. And you look at the holiness group. We have several hands, and I'll get you, I promise, very quickly. Look at the holiness group, and a lot of good folks in that group. But they take this very literal. 1 Corinthians 11, in that, or I should say, they believe it applies today. And you'll see them, and their hair will be like Rapunzel. I don't mean to joke by that. It's very, very long, and they'll have it. It'll go down to the floor, and they'll never cut their hair. They just don't do it. And that's why. And that's long hair. Arguably, none of us have long hair compared to that. I don't know who is first. Let's go with ladies first. Jane?
Also, this is in a context of spiritual gifts, and apparently women were getting the gifts of prophecy, and maybe they wanted to ensure these women were not trying to usurp the authority of men who might not have the spiritual gifts.
Yes.
So in order to show that these women were so submissive, even though they had these gifts, this would show that outwardly that they
Which could have definitely been an issue. I'm glad you brought that up. I mentioned earlier that some suppose this, and it could be referencing spiritual gifts here, this prayer and prophecy. And that's a very good possibility. As Jane mentioned, it's possible that these women might have began to overstep their bounds, having those spiritual gifts, and they needed to be reminded, and that head covering was for that very purpose and would keep them in remembrance of their role. That's a very good point. Yes, sir?
This is no reflection to this congregation.
Sure.
God winked at certain things in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And today, elders wink at certain things in the New Testament. And that's why a lot of the churches of Christ are going denominational, because
Absolutely.
It's this concept, that the biggest excuse is culture and how it is today versus when it was back then. But the whole thing rests on what I asked you, I think.
Sure.
Was this a commandment of God, or was it just a practice at that time?
Yeah, that's the question. And maybe I say it's a commandment of God, and I guess probably what you mean by that question is it a biblical command that God gave to all men? And the answer to that would be no. But as far as the church was concerned, and as far as the answer to their question at Corinth in the first century, whatever, it had something to do with these coverings and hair and the veil, and for them, Paul gave them something that was binding because it was shameful. And it is. I think it would be fair to compare it somewhat to the meat offered to idol situation. You've got brethren who would have been offended by this, but more so than that, you see God literally say that you're going to dishonor Christ, man, if you have a covering, if a male has a cover. Verse 3 is not cultural. There's nothing cultural about verse 3, that's for sure. But he mentions, this is a unique case because he mentions that it is a custom, a cultural kind of situation. And that if, with that exception. It is a difficult, very difficult text. And I'm not answering the question to the best of my ability because I'm getting the same one, so I know that I'm not explaining it well, and I apologize. I think, actually, I saw there were hands over here first. I think David was next. Do you have a thought, David? Well, that's true. And some even argue, based on that Greek term, that the veil would have also covered the face. There is a good study on that. I don't know if we can be for sure, but a lot of commentaries suggest that it would have covered the whole face. You very well might be right about that. And again, if you believe this is still binding, the question would be, are you doing it? And if you're concerned about it, then do that. There's nothing wrong with that. I know good ladies in the Lord's body that do wear coverings. Absolutely. It's not very common, but I've seen them. And as long as you're not binding where God has it bound, if that's something you want to do and that you're comfortable with, certainly you would not be in violation of it. Jim? Yes.
And women used to wear small little things that had veils to it.
Yes.
And I mean, that's just 50 years ago. Those stuff, women, like Easter, the big huge hats.
Yes. And you see them with the fruit on the hat even. And, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. They're competing who got the biggest hat. Yes. Absolutely, that's true. And that, like you said, that was just 50 years ago. This is 2,000 years ago, and certainly their culture could have been and was much different. Larry, did you have your hand up?
You answered part of it. Verse 3 certainly is not cultural.
Yes.
And if we let culture be our standard, where does that place us today with women equality?
Yes. Yeah, that's the argument, isn't it, that comes up? Were you done? I interrupted you if you weren't rather.
No.
Okay, yeah, you're exactly right. That's an argument that often comes up culturally. That was almost the primary argument for that is, that's a cultural thing. Now it's different. Now women don't have to. But you go to 1 Timothy 2, and he doesn't mention culture there like he does here. He says there, it is because Adam was first formed and then Eve, and Eve was in the sin. So you don't have, he clarifies, that's not a cultural thing. But here you've got a unique case where he says it is cultural. And again, if you're going to bind it, there's a lot of questions for whatever reason that God did not give an answer for us. What are the details of that covering? Why don't we see the apostles doing that or talking about their wives doing that? Or why is it there more information? It's a very unique question that we got to read that Paul answered for them. But it's like I say, it's not. Did that bell just ring again? Yes. Okay. Our time is up, but I hope you'll continue to study this. And I tell you what, next week, because it was a rather good discussion, next week we'll just pick up right here in case you've studied it and you have another thought or two, and then we'll continue on into our subject. If you like to kind of be studying about tattoos, 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20, that is our next one that was given to me. It probably won't be much easier than that one, but we'll talk about that next week as well, Lord willing. Appreciate your time, your good discussion, and I hope that this was less confusing and more the opposite than anything. Thank you so much.